I cringed the first time I heard these words come out of my mom's mouth. We're heading for breakfast. We neared the restaurant, and she exclaimed, "Okay, Jesus, give me a parking spot right in front of the doors so Teddy doesn't have to walk so far." Teddy being her husband with very bad arthritic knees. Why did that bother me so? It was actually somewhat touching that she had such a relationship with Jesus that she could ask for something so personal. Hadn't that been what I have been preaching for the last 38 years? That God is an intimate God involved in our lives? So why was I so bothered? Wasn't it what I believed? But to hear it out loud really shook me up. And so for the next few days and weeks and months, I pondered what it was that bothered me so. And what I finally recognized was that it wasn't so much that it bothered me, is that it was so incongruent with what I had been taught. You see, in seminary, they didn't teach you much about how to relate to God, or how to create a personal relationship with God or with Jesus. There were no courses on that. There was no work on prayer. It was just assumed that you would learn how to do it. And so the focus was to fill our heads with information about God, about Jesus, about things like theology and worship and scripture, but never how those things all were integrated into some kind of a healthy relationship with God that might cause you, heaven forbid, to ask God for a parking spot in front of the restaurant so that your crippled husband wouldn't have to walk so far. Whether it was that manner of teaching, which also carried over, I think, for many of us into our preaching and teaching, or whether it's something endemic in our society these days. But one of the prevailing understandings of God, particularly in those under the age of 60, is what in some church sociological circles is called the MTD God, the moralistic, therapeutic, and deistic version of God. Moralistic in that God's desire for us is to be nice people, not jerks. Therapeutic in that for us the aim of our relationship with God is that we might feel good. And we see this particularly in our worship these days. Deistic in that God is out there somewhere. We're not really sure where, but God's there. We're pretty confident of that. But God's really not doing anything where God is, particularly as it involves my life. This was driven home earlier this year when I taught my course in Introduction to Scripture. The book that we were using was the textbook that I wrote, and out of the 300 some pages, all of the questions had to do with a statement I made early in the book, where I said the biblical understanding of God is very different than much of what we think about God these days. And they wanted to really challenge that, particularly the latter piece, that God is somehow not all-powerful, unchangeable, that these things are foreign concepts to Scripture. And yet if you read Scripture, you find a very different picture of God than that deistic kind of aloof God. It is a God that likes to do things hands-on. A God who is incredibly passionate for his people. A God who listens and watches his people. A God who hears the cries of his people as they languish in slavery in Egypt and brings them out with a mighty arm and an outstretched hand. A God who sees the nation of Israel going down the cosmic commode fast and intervenes as his people fall into exile and goes with them that they might come to know God differently. It is a God who comes in human form in Jesus the Christ, that God may know intimately what it is that this human being is all about. Our hopes, our dreams, our fears, our worries, our anxieties. It is a God that hears and sees and listens to our cries, our prayers, even the silly ones for a parking spot. This is the God that has walked with us, particularly these last few months, hearing the cries of COVID, hearing the cries of political upheaval, hearing the brokenness that we are experiencing. This is the God who comes into our lives intimately, personally, that we might know God's love in new ways. It is a God that continues to call, gather, enlighten, sanctify, and keep us in faith, that we may know the riches of that relationship with God and with one another. And so perhaps the best thing we can do is to listen to what God is hearing and where God is calling us to be, together in community, with one another and with God. For in God's eyes, there is no difference between the two. Here in this place the new light is shining, now is the darkness vanished away. See in this space our fears and our dreamings, brought here to you in the light of this day. Gather us in, the lost and forsaken. Gather us in, the blind and the lame. Call to us now, and we shall awaken. We shall arise at the sound of our name. Not in the dark of buildings confining, not in some heaven light years away. Here in this place the new light is shining. Now is the kingdom, now is the day. Gather us in, then hold us forever. Gather us in and make us your own. Gather us in, all peoples together. Fire of love in our flesh and our bones.